Welcome, everybody. My name's Gary Fortney, and this is The Trend. The Trend is our weekly podcast brought on by Trend Media, LLC, and Trend Media is based in the St. Louis region. We talk about different issues affecting true crime, law enforcement trends, and overall trends in the region, all different topics on different days. And this is the beginning of Pam Hupp month. This is the first episode of 3 regarding an individual known as Pam Hupp. And those of us that know about the case, we call it the Pam Hupp saga. It's a saga of what's taken place with this individual regarding several murders that have taken place in the St. Louis area, specifically St. Charles, Lincoln County, and St. Louis County. That's not a murder. We have what's called a suspicious death. And this is the first episode. The episodes are going to focus on 3 individuals. The first one is an individual named Betsy Faria. Betsy lived in Lincoln County, Missouri. The next is Louis Grumpenberger. Louis was killed at a house in St. Charles in the city of O'Fallon. And the last episode, which will be the final, will be on an individual named Shirley Newman. Even though the last name's Newman, Shirley Newman is Pam Hupp's mother. And that is being investigated by the St. Louis County, Missouri Police Department. And we'll have a special guest for the Shirley Newman case, who will be the head of the St. Louis County Homicide Unit, whose unit is investigating that death. So today, let me do an introduction of the guests for the podcast regarding the death of Betsy Faria. First, we have Brian Hilke, retired. Brian is a retired lieutenant from the O'Fallon, Missouri Police Department. Brian was a supervisor in charge of the O'Fallon Police Detective Bureau, and his department got involved with the Pam Hupp saga when one of his investigators or detectives actually was on what's called the Major Case Squad and worked the death of Betsy Faria. We have Aly Vogt. Aly Vogt is the producer of the Trend podcast and works for Trend Media, LLC. Aly is here as a guest who's going to be basically asking Brian questions about the case that happened in Lincoln County. I'll throw in some opinions, some knowledge I have about the case, and where the case started, where it ended up, and then we're going to talk about how the case ultimately leads to the second episode will be the death of Louis Grumpenberger. So anyways, let's start a little bit with the background. What date and time did this happen, Aly?
The Betsy Faria murder took place on December 27th of 2011.
So 2011, we're talking several years ago, and that's when she died. That's when, what was the crime? Was it an accident, natural, suicide? What was it?
So initially there was a question as to whether or not it was a suicide, but it was pretty clear that it was a homicide.
Yeah. And in the state of Missouri and throughout, homicide is not necessarily a crime. All homicide is the killing of one person by another. And that goes on to my students who I teach as part of me being a college professor. What is the crime associated with homicide in the state of Missouri? It's murder and manslaughter. So ultimately, from the thought of being a suicide, turned into be the murder of Betsy Faria, which is a homicide that was investigated by the Major Case Squad. And so the investigation took place. Brian Hilke, one of his investigators from O'Fallon Police Department, was part of the Major Case Squad and responded to the scene out in Lincoln County regarding the death of Betsy Faria. So, Brian, can you start a little bit about the response there, and then Aly's going to ask some questions. I'll fill in as we go along the way.
Sure. So, one of the benefits of the Major Case Squad, at least for my detectives, we handled all our own homicides and officer-involved shootings and custody deaths, but my detectives got a lot of good experience by being part of the Major Case Squad. I was a part of the Major Case Squad. Started out as an investigator when I was a detective. I was a deputy report officer and eventually a deputy commander. And generally, when an agency activates Major Case, they have specific officers or investigators that are kind of tasked with the roles of finding a deputy report officer, finding a deputy commander, finding the investigators. And I remember getting a call from one of those roster personnel folks and was asking for investigators to investigate this homicide, and we sent one of our detectives.
Major Case Squad is a collective group of officers and investigators from departments in Illinois, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, St. Charles County, and they combine to do investigative work regarding homicides that occur in all these jurisdictions. And they're called in by the local law enforcement agency. And the Major Case Squad works on it, a collective effort with multiple investigators. And after so much time period, if it's not solved, they turn the case back over to the host agency to continue on. So one of Brian's investigators was to the homicide of Betsy Faria. Brian, can you provide a little bit about maybe the scene or set it up for us about what he discovered there? Because you've got a little bit of knowledge about the case, about what happened.
Sure. So Lincoln County, who originally responded, showed up. They obviously located multiple stab wounds to the victim, Betsy Faria. And like any investigation, you always start with what we call the inside and work the way out. Right? When we talk about possible suspects, we always are going to start looking at the people that are family, that are intimately involved with the victim, because more times than not, that is generally who your suspect is. And then once you're able to clear those people, you're the family, relatives, friends, then you start expanding out unless you have specific information that leads you elsewhere. So for them to kind of look at Russ initially, that's not a surprise. I mean, again, so Russ Faria was Betsy's husband. And one of the things that I know that they did early on was get a detailed timeline alibi from Russ as far as what he had been doing leading up to the homicide.
And Russ is the one who found his wife dead, correct?
Yeah, so he was the one that came home, discovered his wife. I believe initially he thought that she had committed suicide because she had attempted suicide in the past. She had stage 4 cancer. A lot of the wounds were not visible initially because of the clothes and the items. I believe she had like a blanket on her and things like that. And he did call 911, believed that his wife committed suicide, and that's when law enforcement showed up.
Let me talk about the investigation on scene of a dead body. Law enforcement goes to the scene. Per Missouri state statute, law enforcement officers, homicide detectives are not allowed to move, manipulate, or change the position of the body. The body belongs to the coroner's office or the medical examiner. So while we'll go there, look at the body, make an assessment, we cannot take anything, move anything. It's not until the coroner or medical examiner gets there that law enforcement is allowed to be involved in the body investigation itself. Now, in some limited circumstances, you may get permission from the coroner or medical examiner to maybe retrieve a wallet or get some item out of the victim's pocket for identification purposes. But generally speaking, it has to be authorized by the coroner medical examiner, and then we don't have any authority to do so. So we're very keen about that. So he finds his wife with multiple injuries, we call traumatic injuries, suspicious in nature. He calls it as a suicide. And police respond. Aly, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, so she was found with, 55 stab wounds, I think, in total?
Yeah, I believe that's what the medical examiner determined.
That's a lot of stab wounds. Does that signify anything from your experience?
Yeah, and I would say that from talking to my investigator at the time that was on the major case squad, that would probably be another reason why they looked really closely at Russ, the husband, because what we would call overkill. That many stab wounds generally means there's some kind of emotion, some kind of passion. There's usually a personal connection, unless it's somebody that might have some kind of psychological disorders, like maybe they're schizophrenic or they're suffering some psychosis, where you're going to see like this overkill. So for them to really focus on Russ again was not out of the ordinary.
That's called a controlled frenzy if it goes wild sometimes with the amount of death. Let me give you an example. Somebody comes home, they're stabbed one time and found dead there, and it looks like things were taken. Usually a robbery or a burglary suspect will come in, try to take property or get what they want, and leave as quick as they can. They might do one stab wound and make a quick escape, therefore to leave without getting caught. And when you see multiple traumatic injuries, either two things: they wanted to make sure the person was dead, all right? Or they want to make sure that they showed the disdain, or they wanted to show the violent nature of how they felt towards the victim to do that much damage to the body. So, Aly, pick it up.
Yeah, so where were the stab wounds located?
So initially, a lot of the stab wounds you could not see, like we discussed, and the majority of those stab wounds were post-mortem. So she had already passed away, had died, when those majority of those stab wounds had been inflicted. She had multiple stab wounds to the neck area, to her chest area. I mean, really all over her body, there were multiple stab wounds.
Let me talk real quick about, he said post-mortem. There's three different types of injuries that are sustained to a body regarding when they die. There's a pre-mortem, which means it happens before death, all right? There's perimortem, P-E-R-I, perimortem, which means it's just the time at death, but they're still alive. So perimortem is just at the time of death. And then there's postmortem injuries. When you have postmortem injuries on a body, All right, if I have seen being a homicide detective, again, I was a homicide detective for about 15 years out of my career at the St. Louis County Police Department. We look at the nature of the injuries, the violent nature of the injuries, and is it pre, peri, or post-mortem injuries. So anyways, go ahead, Aly.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit about the 911 call. I think is pretty significant to this case. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about how that played into the case?
Sure. There's a retired lieutenant named Tracy Harpster who kind of came up with the 911 analysis. And his belief is that there's certain indicators on a 911 call that can either indicate that someone is the murderer or is not the murderer. And I know that specifically the Lincoln County detectives at the time had been to his course before, and I know they focused really heavily on this 911 call. And I've been to Tracy's class. I actually use his theory and his training in our investigations. I think the difference is that you can't focus on just one piece. You know, everything plays a role and everything's important, but you can't just focus on one specific thing. And I think where things kind of got off the rails in this specific investigation is they listened to this 911 call, and if you listen to it, it definitely does not sound real. It doesn't sound legitimate. It doesn't sound like a natural reaction somebody would have. So for them to kind of clue in on that and kind of say, this just doesn't sound right, I could see where they would do that because I would do the same thing. But the problem is you can't just focus on that alone. And I think that's really where the investigation kind of got off the rails.
Let's talk a little bit about the evidence. Was there any pieces of evidence that really stood out when investigators were looking?
Yeah, so, and like Gary was saying, the major case squad, when they were activated, I believe they were out there for 5 days, which is a general kind of timeline for a major case. They'll usually stay activated for up to 5 days. They can get extended, but generally 5 days is kind of the typical response time. They did end up turning that investigation back over to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department at that time, and they are the ones that actually pursued criminal charges against Russ. He was not charged with a crime during the time Major Case Squad was activated. That was after they left. And some of the evidence that, they did a very good job. They got a good timeline from Russ. One of the big things that we always talk about is you got to get that timeline. You have to establish that alibi. Russ's alibi was that he was playing basically games, watching movies with multiple friends in O'Fallon, actually. And based on his timeline and based on the physical evidence of Betsy Faria, there really was no way that he could have committed the murder. One of the original officers on scene said that Betsy showed signs of rigor mortis. Now, if he had just gotten home and stabbed her to death, there would be no way that there would be any rigor mortis within the time of him calling 911 to the time that law enforcement responded.
Let's talk about rigor mortis real quick. What is rigor mortis? A rigor mortis is the stiffening of the joints after death. Now, rigor mortis starts to stiffen. Rigor mortis becomes fixed, which means the joints don't move, and then rigor mortis goes away out of the body after so long. So you can have early rigor, fixed rigor, and the rigor that is dissipating out of a body. So if rigor is starting, that means that the body is beginning to stiffen, and it's the joints based on enzymes, and so it's stiffening. And there's another terminology, it's called livor mortis, not liver but livor, L-I-V-O-R mortis, which is the pulling the blood at the lowest point of gravity in the body. That'll be talked about in a subsequent episode regarding forensic terms and terminology and death investigations. So anyways, I'll go ahead and continue. I just want to describe what rigor mortis is. And if rigor mortis is starting, that means the body had been there for a little bit of an extended period of time.
And just to continue on your question, I know one of the original officers that showed up, said that the body was cool to the touch, which again, if she had just been murdered, that would not be the case. So there was a lot of things as far as Russ's alibi, as far as where he was, what he was doing, the time that he got home, and the time of death. The murder had to happen when he had 4 alibi witnesses who were saying that he was with them at the time of the murder.
So it seems like detectives were able to establish a pretty clear alibi. Why do you think that they kept pursuing him as a suspect?
That's a good question. Yeah.
Sure. This is where we kind of, we talk about, we get focused on our own theories, our own beliefs, instead of following the facts. And that's where, you'll see in some of these investigations where investigators will try to shove a square peg into a round hole. And I'm not very good at geometry, but I know that can't happen. You can't do that.
Let's use a hammer hard enough.
Well, yeah, and I guess you bust it up. I don't know if bust is a word, but we'll use it.
Sarah, look it up. Sarah's working the board today.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Okay. And that's what happened in this case. You had investigators that were so dead set that Russ had done this that they really ignored a lot of evidence that really exonerated him. He had a receipt of where he bought food, where he got dog food, where he went to the store, the drive time that he said that he left his friend's house in O'Fallon to the time that he got there. He had no blood on his clothes. There was no blood on him. For somebody getting stabbed 55 times, you would think that there would be cast off. There would be some kind of blood transfer, some kind of evidence transfer, and there was none of that.
Let's talk about cast off. Cast off is where you have the transfer of blood from the source location to another object. And the evidence of stabbings or some type of sharp objects, you're going to go down thrust with the knife or sharp object, and when you bring the knife back, you're going to have blood coming off of the blade that's going to go onto vertical surfaces. And cast off means you can pretty much show the location of where the death or the actual traumatic stabbings occurred. So you're going to have downward thrust, bringing the knife up, blood coming off the knife or object into a wall or some other area. That's where you can pinpoint. That's what cast off is. So.
Well, they didn't find any blood in shower drains or sink drains or anywhere else really in the home. I mean, how can you explain that?
Right. So one of the theories for the sheriff's department at the time, and I think it's important to note that the sheriff at the time is no longer there. There's a new sheriff. There's a new prosecutor. I believe all the investigators that were there at the time are no longer with the sheriff's department. One of the beliefs that they had was that he had to clean up. You know, if he had no blood on him, what happened to his clothes? How did he not have any blood on him? And one of the things that the major case squad did is they actually called out the St. Charles County crime scene unit to do the crime scene processing. And I know one of the individuals who responded to that. She's no longer crime scene, but she does some other stuff kind of related.
Oh, by the way, I did get word from the control room. Bust is, in fact, a word from our brain room, so the control room comes forward. I want to leave that in the podcast because whenever I get a chance to find Brian wrong on a certain individual topic, I relish the fact and I relish the moment. Let me sit here in a beam of light.
Well, for the record, I didn't say it wasn't. I said I wasn't sure if it was a word.
Okay, I was sure it was. So the brain room and the control room found out for me. So let's continue on.
Continuing on. Her first name's Amy. I don't want to say her whole name, but she is amazing at what she did. She was an amazing crime scene investigator. They pulled the drain traps. They looked for blood evidence. They looked for water, and there was none of that. There was no blood. There was no water. Nothing that indicated that there was any kind of cleanup, that he took any kind of shower or bathe. A phenomenal job on the initial call out, and that's where later on when Lincoln County took over, there was some evidence, and I'll put in quotation marks, that came up that tried to indicate that Russ had cleaned up and done these things. There were some statements made in court that years later that, oh, well, now I do remember seeing water in the sink or in the drain. And, those are, I will say, dubious at best. When you go years later.
Yes, explain a little bit more. I want to get out of the
dubious.
Yeah, what do you think? What word would you use in place of dubious?
Questionable.
All right, there we go. Okay, questionable evidence that was found by law enforcement or reported by law enforcement?
Reported years later to help fit a narrative that Russ had committed this crime. And those are always concerning when you have a unit that I've worked with hand in hand on multiple serious crimes who have done a great job and said there's nothing there, and then years later you have others coming in saying, oh, well, yeah, there was. Who do you believe?
Never have the evidence fit the narrative, all right? The narrative, you make sure the evidence, substantiates. So anyways.
One place that they did find blood was on a pair of slippers. Russ's slippers, they were thrown back into the closet. Was there anything out of the ordinary about those?
Yeah, and those are things, too, that, when you look at the pictures of the slipper, if Russ was wearing slippers, I'll ask you, where would you expect to find blood on the slippers?
I mean, going off of what Gary was talking about, cast off and what's coming out towards you, I mean, I would expect to find blood on on the tops.
And the bottoms, right? If there's a lot of blood that if I'm wearing slippers,
You're going to walk through it.
I'm going to walk through it, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about cast off doesn't look like you dunked it in a bucket, right? It's spots. And, you could probably have a whole episode on velocity and all those different terminologies when it comes to blood spatter analysis.
It's a blood spat. Anybody that says blood splat, okay, they get that wrong on my exams in my college class.
Did I get that right?
You said spat. Good job, Brian.
Thanks. Just wanted to make sure. And if you look at the picture, it really looks like somebody had literally dipped this slipper into blood. And if Russ had worn that slipper, why would he have put that back in his closet when all his other clothes would have had blood and they recovered no other pieces of clothing that had blood on it? So one could speculate that it almost looked like somebody was trying to, quote unquote, frame Russ by taking his slipper, dipping it in blood, and then placing it back into his closet.
When you said frame, that's kind of concerning.
Absolutely, especially if you're Russ.
And who would have the opportunity to do that?
So, one of the things that we always look at too, and especially when it goes to trial, most people want to know, Aly, if you were sitting on a jury and they showed all this evidence, what would be the one thing that you would want to know?
Who else might have had an opportunity?
Okay. How about the why? How about a motive? So those would be things that we would look at from an investigative standpoint. Why would somebody want to kill Betsy Faria? Now, the theory with Russ is that several days prior to the homicide, Betsy had a life insurance policy that she signed as the beneficiary, her friend, Pam Hupp. Theory is that Russ found out about this, became enraged, and in a moment of anger, stabbed her 55 times. Now, who else has a motive?
Well, Pam Hupp seems like she would have a pretty good motive there.
Yeah, it's a $150,000 motive. And, those are things that as investigators we have to look at. Why would somebody want to do this? Who benefits the most from this? Does Russ really benefit if he knows that this life insurance policy has been transferred over to Pam Hupp? What's the benefit of him killing her when he knows when she dies, Pam gets the money? So, and those are things that they really kind of focused on early on. Was it an act of anger because of this transfer of a beneficiary? Betsy had attempted suicide before. That's why Russ believed that she had committed suicide, because she had attempted it before. She was a stage 4 cancer. She knew she wasn't going to survive. There are things that if you look at the flip side of it, are there things that explains why Russ reacted and thought the way he did?
I look at this case being very interesting because we don't want law enforcement to make sure the death fits their narrative. Okay, we got to get to the truth. I question some of the things law enforcement, I think Brian agrees with that, some of the things that law enforcement did. And let me talk about the corrections that took place. The prosecuting attorney, Mike Wood in Lincoln County, saw a need maybe to get some additional training to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office. And we were hired through Vista Law Enforcement Training to provide a multitude years of training to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office for the road patrol officers and investigators, which we have been doing now for almost, 4 years, Brian?
Yeah.
And I've met a lot of good detectives and officers, which there are a lot of good ones out there. They've taken the training and they've utilized it, I think, in a very positive manner. We're talking about a while, right, from the previous people. So a lot of people there were not investigators. So this is a previous crew that was involved in this investigation, right, Brian?
Yeah, and really, if you look at the past elections, when Sheriff Harrell ran, when he was elected, when Mike Wood ran as a prosecutor, really a lot of it was based on the belief that this Russ Faria investigation prosecution was mismanaged. And I believe, based off what I know, that was a big reason why they got elected in 2020 and in 2024.
And we're trying to fill a gap here with our training and consulting to help them out a little bit. We've done consulting there for cold cases as well as retraining. They've been very receptive, and we've formed some friendships along the way there, too, with the training we're doing. So I'll let you continue on there.
Sure. Going back to some of the evidence that was found, there was a handwritten note said to be penned by Betsy, which detailed her fear that Russ was going to kill her. And it was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about who told detectives to look for this?
Sure. So that was a piece of evidence that actually came up several years later after the initial homicide. It was actually a typed letter. It was typed in a Word document, and it was found on Betsy's computer. I believe it was her laptop or desktop, I'm not sure. And the person who brought this typed letter to law enforcement's attention, to the sheriff's department, was actually Pam Hupp. Pam Hupp mentioned that Betsy had typed this letter. Now, again, this is years later after the initial investigation. And one of the interesting things that came out through the investigation is that if you know anything about computers and about programming, usually when you buy like Microsoft Office, you have to register. You can put your name on it. Well, what they found was that the author who had done this program, it was unknown, almost like it had not come from her computer, like somebody had typed that from a different computer and placed it on her computer.
It's kind of funny that Pam Hupp came up with the lead there for law enforcement to investigate.
Well, she came up with a lot of leads over the years. Her story changed multiple times. Lincoln County did interview her multiple times. One of the things that she changed was the fact, did she ever go inside the house when she dropped Betsy off? First she said no, and then she said, well, I just went to the front door, and then it changed to, well, I went inside, and all these different varying stories that she told that were not consistent throughout the years.
And these have been videotaped, right?
Yes.
We're out there and look at the interviews that were done with Pam Hupp. And so the investigation goes on. What do you think was the critical point of them charging Russ Faria for the murder?
I do believe that the results of the polygraph exam, I think, played a big role in the initial charging. Russ was administered a polygraph exam. The examiner who gave the test deemed that he showed deception, and I do believe that played a role in the Sheriff's Department and the prosecutor, Lee Askey, at the time, in their decision to file charges.
Polygraph is a tool that is utilized. I always use it as a last resort, as the very last part of an investigation. I don't use that as the form. Like I would not give a polygraph the very first part. That's towards the end to either prove or disprove evidence what we have. You agree, Brian, with that?
Yeah, it obviously plays a role. I mean, there are times when you might want to use it early on. If you have a missing person or a missing kid, sometimes you can there's different techniques that you can use.
But that's a time critical factor.
Correct. But in a normal, quote unquote, normal investigation, generally you do hold back and wait for the polygraph until you have a good chunk of the investigation done, because it is not a substitute for the investigation. It's just part of it.
Brian's a certified law enforcement polygraph examiner. He's certified through the law enforcement polygraph as well as the police polygraph, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, so the American Polygraph Association and the American Association of Police Polygraphists.
Yep. It's polygraphist, by the way, is for
yes.
polygraphs.
Thanks for clarifying.
So I'm going to make sure he did that. So anyways, I've been doing polygraphs for how long, Brian?
18 years.
18 years. Been reading people, looking at people. I don't want to get too much into this. I got to be delicate. The polygraph that was administered, do you think it could have been administered in maybe a different or better way than what it was?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to how if I was asked to administer it, one of the things that we do as polygraph examiners is, before we even really begin, is we ask specific psychological and physiological questions. Some of those might be, how much sleep have you had? Have you had anything to eat? How much sleep have you had? Are you intoxicated? Are you under any kind of narcotics or any kind of drug influence? And those can factor in, and if certain questions on those are answered a certain way, I will not give a test. If somebody tells me that they have not had any sleep, they've been up for 27 hours, that they haven't eaten, that they just recently used some kind of marijuana or any kind of narcotic, I will not administer the test because it can affect the results.
Regarding this test, I'm not going to say who did it, which agency or anything. I just want to get a little bit more specific. Were there some questions about the physiological well-being or the way the test was administered based upon some of the questions you would have asked?
Yeah, so
I want to be careful here, okay? But
yeah,
I think this is all part of it, though.
Sure. Part of the issue, too, is the actual polygraph charts themselves, and I believe the report were not part of the police report. I don't know if it got lost, I don't know what happened. Not being able to see the charts, not being able to watch the video, things like that.
And is there a video chart? Have you found them yet?
I believe there's what we call a post-test. So after the charts are administered, we can conduct what's called a post-test, and that's where if somebody fails the exam, we can basically do further interviewing with them. I know there is a video of that. I don't believe that there was any saved video of the actual exam itself.
How about the charts?
I do not believe the charts were saved either.
And you as a polygraph examiner, you'd want to look at those, right? You look at both the video and the charts combined for kind of a confirmation, I guess, or just analyst.
Yeah, so as a certified polygraph examiner through APA, American Polygraph Association, and American Association of Police Polygraphists, some of the requirements are that we video record the entire interview from start to finish, that we maintain the charts, that we maintain all the records. to be a professional, standardized polygraph examiner, those are things that you should be doing every time you give it.
How about a little bit enough? But Brian actually teaches at a polygraph school out in California, and he's been teaching there for several years. Not only does he administer them for almost 20 years, he also teaches polygraph examinations. Again, just one last part of this. Was there anything with the questions regarding sleep, drugs, or anything that may have resulted in you maybe not giving a polygraph to
and just based off of the information that I'm aware of, again, I wasn't directly involved in the initial investigation or the polygraph that was administered to Russ, but I based off the information I know, he had recently used marijuana, that he had been up for, I believe, 28 hours.
Yeah.
He had actually been in custody for, I think, a long time. Enough where he wasn't able to get any sleep, get any rest. Me personally, if somebody would have asked me under those conditions to administer a test, I would have told them no.
And I think to put the weight of an investigation on a polygraph, first of all, is questionable for me as a homicide detective. Then have a test administered with the questionable physiological background and psychological aspects that could happen with marijuana, which is hallucinogen, would question me. So, Aly, if you want to continue on there, we kind of got that a little bit.
Yeah, so because there was no blood found anywhere on Russ or really anywhere in the house, there were no bloody clothes found, the prosecutor brought up the possibility that Russ had committed this crime naked. What do you think the possibility of that is?
Well, how can you resolve it if the theory is that he became enraged and upset? You can't have it both ways. You can't be calm and calculating and thoughtful and planning and cunning, and also be upset, angry at the same point. So if he even if he had done it naked, there still would have been some kind of cleanup. There still would have been something in the sink, something in the shower drains, and none of that was found. And the fact that he had 4 independent people that verified that he was at their house in O'Fallon, and based on the information of what her condition of her body was at the time the police responded, there's no practical way he could have done that, cleaned up, got rid of everything. It's impossible.
All right. When did police eventually decide to charge him?
Yeah, I believe it was several weeks after the major case squad disbanded.
So was that within a month, you think?
Yes.
That's quick.
Yes. I believe they showed up to Russ's house. They placed him under arrest, took him back. I will say, before we get too far, shout out to Russ's attorney, Joel Schwartz. He's very well known in the St. Louis area, great criminal defense attorney. And, he believed Russ from day one. And he continued, even after he got convicted, Joel continued to fight to show that he had not done this. Actually won an appeal to have the retrial fast-tracked. And I know if I was charged with something I didn't do, he would be the first person I would call.
Didn't Joel write a book about this also?
He did, him and Russ.
And Brian's been on Dateline a couple of times, and Brian's also done some interviews with several entities regarding the investigation of Pam Hupp, mostly in the O'Fallon case. This all ties into it, too. Anyways, Aly, go ahead. That's I don't know if it's okay. Just about the evidence, do you think they had, or how do I say this? What about the substantial evidence they had to charge him? Would they be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt?
Well, obviously he was convicted.
Yeah.
Now, one could argue that Russ's attorney was not allowed to present other theories and other evidence that might have exonerated or found him not guilty by a reasonable doubt. Was there enough evidence? Obviously, there was a jury there that, based off what they heard, they believed. However, when it went to the appellate court, they determined that there was multiple errors committed during the trial, which remanded it back for a retrial. A new judge heard the case and made really some interesting comments about the investigation itself. And I know, Aly, you and I have talked off camera about that. I don't know if you want to address that, but it's pretty interesting to hear what that judge's comments were in the second trial.
Yeah, in the second trial, the judge actually called the investigation rather disturbing. And I think that
the law
really,
enforcement part, Aly?
Yeah, the law enforcement, specifically Lincoln County's contributions, rather disturbing, and I think that really speaks to the volume of how it was mismanaged.
Yeah, and that's the thing that when you have bias, you can't force the evidence to fit your beliefs. You have to make your beliefs based on what the evidence shows. And I believe that the investigators at that time got tunnel vision. They believed in their heart. And I think to this day, there's many of them that still believe Russ committed the crime. And it's mind-boggling. But I guess once you believe in something so fervent that no matter what somebody shows you or tells you, you're going to believe what you're going to believe.
Would you mind talking a little bit more about why wasn't Joel Schwartz able to talk about theories involving Pam Hupp or even the life insurance policy and the switch in beneficiary?
Sure. So when he tried to bring that up as part of his case, the judge at the time that heard the first trial had a hearing without the jury present, and both the prosecutor and Joel made their arguments as to why he should be able to bring this in, and the judge at the time determined that he could not. And that is part of the reason that the appellate court overturned his conviction and remanded it back for a retrial.
And to be remanded for a retrial, that means they dismiss the conviction, goes back for a retrial. Was the evidence that originally was dismissed or not allowed by the judge, was it reintroduced in the second trial, Brian? Were you aware of that?
Yes, so Joel in the second trial was able to produce his version and his beliefs and his arguments on who he believed committing the crime, which was obviously Pam Hupp.
And the life insurance policy, that's, I think, a big part regarding motive. I think that should have been introduced because that's a big part of this entire case. That was the motive for both Russ committing the crime because she changed the policy, Betsy did, to Pam Hupp. And then Russ killed her because she changed the policy to Pam Hupp. So that was a big part of it.
And if you listen to the multiple interviews that Pam gave throughout the years through both of these trials, originally she said that Betsy asked her to become the beneficiary so she could keep the money for the kids, for her daughters. And she was talked into putting that into a trust before the first trial. And then after that trial where Russ was convicted, she immediately took that out of the trust and refused to give the money back to the children. There was actually a civil trial that the daughters of Russ and Betsy filed against Pam, and unfortunately Pam actually won that civil trial and she was allowed to keep the insurance money.
Do you think the timing of her moving that money right after the end of his trial, do you think that's suspicious at all?
Well, and if you look at some of the interviews that were recorded by the Lincoln County investigators, she actually says, yeah, it's my money. I don't have to give it back. And she was kind of confronted, well, hey, you said originally that you were going to give this back. And she basically was like, I'm not giving it back.
Yeah, it's kind of disappointing. You got to take care of the kids. It just didn't happen under that circumstance. So Russ was convicted. A retry took place. And let's talk about the retry that took place a little bit. What did Joel Schwartz, and his attorney, on the retrial? Yes. And the retry that took place, was there a change of venue or was it still in Lincoln County?
It was still in Lincoln County, I believe, but it was heard by, I believe, a St. Charles County judge. The name is escaping me, but it was a judge outside of Lincoln County that heard the case. And it was, in the first trial, it was a jury trial. He was convicted by a jury. In the second trial, they chose a bench trial, and the judge actually made the determination of not guilty.
So a defendant has a choice. They can either have a trial by jury and where the jury decides, or they can have a bench trial where there's no jury. The judge makes a decision after hearing evidence, or unless they do what's called a summary judgment, they can dismiss the case even before the end of the trial. So the judge dismissed the case. Let me talk about law enforcement a little bit. Again, I don't want to get, we'll talk and see how this goes. Did law enforcement change anything regarding what they testified to between the first trial and second trial that the judge heard or that was later found out?
Yeah, and that's where we talk about some of some of the quote-unquote evidence that came out after the initial investigation. I believe you had one officer who arrived on scene who years later testified that he actually did see water in the sink or in the bathtub when years prior, nobody saw any water. There was a crime scene investigator for Lincoln County who said that he conducted some forensic testing for blood and took photographs, and these photographs showed that there was a cleanup of blood. However, the pictures were never produced or could not be found until the second trial when somehow they were leaked to Joel Schwartz, who then confronted this crime scene investigator on the stand where the photographs actually showed no cleanup. So, those are very concerning.
That's concerning, yeah.
Very concerning. And there's obviously, I'm sure, part of the reason as to why Russ won a civil judgment against Lincoln County.
To have that happen too, and this is law enforcement. We want to make sure things are done the right way, and to change testimony between different trials. I had a case where I gave depositions, where I have to go in front of defense attorneys and answer questions in front of defense. They asked me, some of these go on for days. I've had two-day depositions. And then after depositions, you go into what's called motion to suppress, and then they try to suppress evidence. You testify in court on a motion, and then you testify at trial. And I had one where we had multiple trials, so I had to maintain my knowledge of the case through my report and other stuff. And you need to be consistent. I mean, you tell the truth, it's consistent. If you don't tell the truth, it's not.
I was about ready to say, is if you tell the truth, it's really easy to keep a straight story.
Well, I know that they had law students in one of my murder cases I was working, and they actually had all my testimony from both the deposition and the first trial, looking through any inconsistencies. Law students actually do get cases like this to look at, to kind of supplement the defense attorneys to try to find evidence to try to show somebody not guilty. And I had multiple law students going through my whole testimony trying to find inconsistencies and just stick with what the investigation was, and it turned out.
Follow the facts.
Yep.
So the prosecutor, Leah Askey, how big of a role do you think she played in the mismanagement of Russ's trial? Do you think was she just going off of what detectives were giving her, or was she really leading the chase here?
Well, it really depends on whose version you believe. I know she's given previous interviews, I believe one to Dateline, where she said that she just followed the quote-unquote evidence that the sheriff's department provided her. The fact that she's the one that has the ultimate decision of issuing a charge, you have to believe that the fact that he was criminally prosecuted and in the first trial convicted, that's on her. She is the one that makes the decision. Law enforcement presents the facts to the prosecution, and the prosecution is the one who decides whether they're going to seek charges or not.
Yep. Law enforcement testimony in this case is concerning, like I say, but remember, that was a different group of investigators at Lincoln County. We've met a lot of good investigators there who have trained, and it was kind of reemphasized that point. When Russ was found not guilty in the second trial, Mike Wood became prosecutor, correct, eventually?
After that, yes.
After that. What did Mike Wood start pursuing then regarding the death of Betsy Faria?
Yeah, so one of the very first things that Mike Wood and Sheriff Harrell did was reopen the case, and that ultimately led to them charging Pam Hupp with the murder of Betsy Faria.
Are you aware of any evidence, or I don't know if you have any? Again, this case is pending still. We got to be careful. Brian and I might have a little bit of knowledge behind the scenes that we will not share, that may be known by law enforcement. But is there anything out there in the public that about why they would charge Pam, like any new evidence? Anything you know that you can share?
Well, the fact that her story changed multiple times, the fact that she has a motive, the fact that she's done it before.
Yeah.
All those, I think, played into it. The fact that she's the last person that saw Betsy alive, or is allegedly the last person who saw Betsy alive. The fact that she says that she was in O'Fallon when her 30 minutes after she says she drops Betsy off at home, she's in O'Fallon, but her phone is pinging off a cell tower in Troy. Those are going to be difficult for her to overcome in the subsequent trial that she's facing.
And in a future episode regarding the death of her mother, Shirley Newman, Pam Hupp was the last person to see her mother, to be with her mother at 8 o'clock at night, and her mother's found dead the following day. Again, we'll get into that case in depth, and then Louis Gumpenberger, she was the last one to be with Louis before he died. So we got 3 different cases there. Anything else you think, Brian, that led Mike Wood to charge Pam Hupp with this case?
Like I said, I think you're going to see a lot of it come out in the trial. He did bring on a special prosecutor, Delaney Harms, who retired from St. Charles County Prosecuting Office. I worked with him for many years. Really good at what he does. I know that they're currently preparing. There's been a lot of delays in the trial based off of judges being recused and judges recusing themselves, and the fact that she's being represented by the public defender's office, and they're obviously backlogged. So I think as this progresses, I know Mike Wood has made statements that he will not accept a plea from her and take the death penalty off the case unless she pleads to every murder that she's done.
Yeah, who knows? That still might be up in the air a little bit about that. But We'll talk about change of venue. A lot of cases, I've had a couple change of venue cases. On a case I worked as a homicide detective regarding publicity. Has there been any attempts or change of venue on this case, Brian?
Yeah, so there was obviously with the O'Fallon case, with the St. Louis County, there's a lot of information, at least on this side of the state. I mean, it's nationally, but definitely very well known on the eastern side of Missouri. There was a change to the western side. Eventually, it was decided that it would be very burdensome on all the witnesses to have to drive that far. So what they ended up doing was requesting another change of venue. The Missouri Supreme Court granted that change from the western side of the state back to actually St. Charles County. It's my understanding that they will probably bus in a jury from probably further out and probably house them here during the trial. So the only ones who really will be inconvenienced will be the jurors.
Will the trial be in St. Charles County or Lincoln County?
It'll be in St. Charles.
And by the St. Charles County judge, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes.
And that is kind of a change of venue from Lincoln County, even though it's only a different county over, but that is a change. And we both know this, I think the public may, but Mike Wood's going for the death penalty in this case based upon her behavior and activities. For a death penalty case, a little bit of a background how this works. You have the initial trial in the death penalty case. If somebody is convicted, there's basically a second trial. And the second trial the jury will determine, is there enough evidence for the death penalty to be pursued? You can have aggravating factors, which shows why they should get the death penalty, and then the defense will prevent mitigating factors about why there should not be the death penalty in a case. And I have had some death penalty cases that I have worked where people have been convicted with the death penalty. And it's a big responsibility, everybody, to work these cases regarding death penalty cases. My thoughts about the death penalty is I let justice take it where it does, okay? I'm indifferent. I'll let the justice system do it. I'm just want the justice system to take it where it is, okay? So if they have the death penalty, that's the way the jury decided, and that's the way it moves forward. And that's speaking from a homicide detective's point of view. If Pam comes clean on her other criminal activity regarding deaths of people, they may take the death penalty off the table. That may tie into a case a little later on if there was suspicious circumstances of her mother. So we'll see where that goes. Are the officers who worked the case originally still with Lincoln County, Brian, or do you know any further information about that?
I believe they've all left Lincoln County. Some might be working in other agencies. I know some have gotten out of law enforcement.
So, yeah, I mean, they're going to have to come back and testify, are they not?
Yes.
So they're going to be testifying a third time. First, the initial trial where Russ Faria was convicted. The second trial where Russ was found not guilty. And the third trial now regarding the prosecution of Pam Hupp. So the same detectives are going to come back and be under oath again to testify in court. I don't think I'll go, because I let law enforcement take it to where it was being retired. I'll follow the case, though. I'll see where it takes us. Brian, what are your thoughts about attending a trial like this? Would you attend?
Depends on how busy Vista is.
Yeah, if we're working.
I might have to be teaching or doing polygraphs, but I would definitely follow it very closely. This will take a lot of interest, so there'll be a lot of people fighting to get in to watch it. So I'll be curious to see if the judge allows cameras. I would imagine that the media will probably request that. I'll be curious to see what the judge, if he grants that or not.
Aly, what do you think? Would you attend if you're able?
Oh, yeah, if I'm able.
Sarah, who's working in the control room behind, would you go, Sarah? Trend Media is a media company. You know that, right? Maybe since it is.
They're going to have to clear probably a month out of their schedule.
However, maybe we can work something out to have maybe somebody from Trend Media attend, since it is a media company, it's part of the press, okay? So maybe we can work that out, maybe get a seat in there. I'll try.
I think we know some people.
So maybe get one or two of you in there as producers. Again, Sarah's the executive producer. It's working the board, and then Aly's producer. So we know some people. Might get you in there with our press credentials, our media credentials. So if you guys would be interested, I like somebody in there to maybe watch. You guys can switch off. Interested if we can do that.
Oh, that'd be really interesting.
Okay.
Maybe I could get you a seat next to the Dateline producer that I know. I'm sure she'll want to be there.
Media sitting together. So, I really enjoyed talking about this case. Again, there's so much more we can get into, but we have to keep the public's interest enough for driving to work to listen to it for the whole episode, or doing some multiple episodes. This is a 3-episode.
I was going to say we got 2 more coming.
Yeah, 2 more coming for the
Pam Hupp month.
Pam Hupp month. The saga of Pam Hupp. Kind of wrap it up here. Aly, what did you find out in your research? Did you see anything in the trial or the case which you saw maybe could have been done different, or maybe could have been better?
I think a lot of things could have been done either differently or better. I really just think I mean, under what circumstances would you guys choose to completely ignore somebody having an alibi like Russ had?
I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's a good point, Aly.
And that's the problem. What my understanding is that one of the investigators, did drove the route from O'Fallon, where Russ was with his friends, to his home to try to explain the time difference. And it's my understanding the detective drove like 100 miles, I'm exaggerating, but like 100 miles an hour, not like a normal speed, to try to cut down the time to give him more time. It's when you do things like that, that's where you run into trouble. And that's where you get, false confessions, where you get wrongful convictions, and where you ultimately end up losing in a civil suit or losing your job.
It's not worth it. And again, I cannot live with myself ever putting somebody innocent in jail or pursuing somebody I didn't think did it. All right. On the other hand, I've worked numerous murder cases, a few that are unsolved. I think I know who did it, but they're out there walking. Again, I'm not going to try to do anything that's improper, illegal, or otherwise not. If you put somebody innocent in jail, the real killer's out there, first of all, right? If you put somebody innocent in jail, what are you doing to the credibility of law enforcement? What are you doing to the credibility and person's life who's innocent? And so, again, we got to be right. And we always have a check and balance system within how we do this. I take it very serious. The true crime aspects of the Trend podcast is very interesting to everybody here. And you have to have it in your heart. And what we also do here is trying to generate interest in these cases to maybe have somebody bring up things on Cold Case we'll talk about. Talk about different things in law enforcement. So, Brian, anything you want to sum up here at the end?
No, it's obviously, when I present this case study in our classes, I tell everybody that every detective dreams for that one 15-minute of fame, that one big case. And this was obviously mine. I never thought in August of 2016 I would really be on Dateline or on podcast talking about a case I worked. It's been very surreal to see that such a case generates so much interest throughout the United States and actually in the world, because I've been on a German podcast as well.
And to be part of this with Trend Media and having the Trend podcast, having Brian and then Aly also here. And then, like I say, the future episode will have the head of the county homicide unit and discuss further. So I want to thank Brian and Aly for here. Thank you, Sarah, for running the board in the control area. And thank all of you for listening. Thank you so much for your interest. Please feel free to email us on any questions, comments, or future topics at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. Again, thetrend@trendmedia, or our website, www.trendmediallc.com. We'd love to see your comments. If you would support us in any way you can, that'd be fantastic. We'll keep things going. I promise we'll keep your interest. For this, Gary Fortney, thanks for listening, and this is The Trend. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Trend. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at The Trend's website at www.trendmediallc.com, or you can email us at any time at thetrend@trendmediallc.com. We welcome everybody's comments, suggestions, or reviews. Don't forget to stay connected with us on social media. Follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Trend Media Podcast, and join the conversation on Facebook by searching The Trend Podcast. Check out our Amazon page through the link on our website, where you'll find some of our recommended products. If you've enjoyed this episode, consider supporting us by donating $5 to our Venmo account at The Trend Podcast. Every little bit helps. Thank you so much for donating. If you're interested in doing so, we really appreciate it. We'll be back next time with more true crime stories, insights on law enforcement trends, and current trends with our region and the people we serve. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay part of The Trend.